Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Rachel Fisher, who has just started her position as Deputy Director for Land Use Policy at DEFRA, responsible for developing and delivering environmental planning reform, local nature recovery strategies, and biodiversity net gain. Before that, she led the development of the £3.6 billion Towns Fund within the local growth unit at MH CLG in Bates, and has also worked on a range of policy roles. And I'm really thrilled to finally have her here to kick off today, talking about the role of land use in thinking about placemaking, well-being, and community empowerment. And may I ask all other speakers to please turn off your video as Rachel speaks. Thanks so much, Rachel. On to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Let me attempt to share my screen because I've got some pictures that we can all look at while I talk. Otherwise, you'll just be looking at me. Right. There we go. Great. So as usual, I have slightly changed my brief a little bit. So really looking at thinking about, placemaking and what are we actually aiming for with the various policy reforms that we have. Hannah's touched on the planning white paper, and I will talk about that a little bit as well. But I want to think a little more broadly about the wider policy implications. And I should probably start out by saying, having just started this job in September, I actually feel like a little bit of a fraud for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm talking to you about planning and the planning reform, and I'm not coming from the department that's actually leading that work. And the second is that I have spent the last 20 years of my career thinking pretty much specifically about towns, cities, regeneration, community engagement, empowerment, and cultural development. And that is not what DEFRA is necessarily known for. So I'm now really, really interested in thinking about how do we start to reconcile the tensions between different kinds of land use. So what I got to in thinking about regeneration in my last role was really, really thinking about cities are basically the constructs that have been made up of different decisions that we have made collectively and individually over the course of generations, but that all comes back to land. It all comes back to how do we choose what we put on a site? How do we choose what value that has, what values we place on it, both monetarily, but also culturally. So I'm really, really interested in kind of thinking through and unpacking all of those kind of bigger questions within the context of broader planning reform and the wider context of just COVID and what we have all learned through this period of lockdown. And as we go into further restrictions, really starting to think through, well, actually, what is it that I value? What is it that I want to see in my neighborhood, in my community, in my city, and in my place more generally? So it's worth thinking about what makes a successful place. So effectively, you probably need people, right? You need jobs for them to do. You need infrastructure which connects them, be that digital like we have now or physical infrastructure. And ultimately, you also need culture, both the kind of high and low culture that makes up a place. But then what are the kind of qualities that a new planning system would be aiming at? What are the kind of qualities of place that we really want to see that make places feel special? So these are my kind of holiday snaps of stuff that I have seen that I think actually start to articulate what it is that we need to be aiming at in places. But I should say that the foundation for me is always kind of starting from people and from local culture and what we actually, what we all kind of do together in places. So the first thing is I think places should be tactile. So that's a door knocker. And what I love about her is that you can see that, hundreds of people walking by her have kind of rubbed her belly and have made her sort of really come alive. And it's the kind of thing where if you've ever walked down the street with kids, you notice that they stop every 15 seconds to pick up a rock or a stone, or they find interest in like tiny little details, which can be infuriating, but also actually really beautiful. So how do you make places that have room for that kind of really detailed kind of texture and beauty and quality? But the second thing, at the other end of the scale, I think places should be kind of numinous. Cities in particular, should remind you that you are part of a bigger whole. So this is Manhattan Henge. So this is Lincoln Center, and kind of every year the sun will line up with the streets and it will set at the bottom of the streets. And it reminds you that kind of even cities, even a big city like Manhattan, is part of a wider natural world, part of a wider natural environment. And I think that that's just a really kind of beautiful reminder of our kind of wider place in the solar system, I guess. But also, places need to be biophilic, right? People love nature. People feel better in nature. I will talk more about that. But the point here is about how do you insert that? How do you make the case for inserting that in cities, in towns, and bringing nature to where people are, particularly in the UK, where the vast majority of people live in towns and cities rather than in rural areas. Next, I think culture. Definitely. What I like about this is it's got people just sort of like randomly sitting out on a summer night. You've got kind of the hoardings, which say you've got new development coming. You've got sort of protest in the form of the banner across the top. You've got this kind of very live public experience, a public dialogue about culture and about its role in society. And then finally, this is my representation of integrated infrastructure, integrated transport. You've got the river, you've got pedestrians, you've got cars, but the cars are actually being squeezed out. You've got the tram, which has been greened. You've got cycleways as well. So you have all of these kind of different kinds of transportation being brought together in a single place, and I think integrated really well. This is in Bilbao, and I think what that does is it helps give people choices, and it makes those choices really evident and really apparent to people. So all of this to say, what does this have to do with well-being? What does this have to do with kind of the topic of the day? And I think these are just some headlines from literally the last week, where people are increasingly, I think because of COVID, if nothing else, becoming increasingly aware of the role that nature plays in their lives and the impact that that has on their health, their well-being, and in some cases, their livelihoods. And I think some of this stuff can be quite surprising, right? So the idea that, you know, urban areas are actually covered in trees, particularly in the UK. So in that last one, like Camden and Croydon are in the top 20 for the most tree-covered places in Britain. That's amazing. That's amazing. So how do you start to think about, well, how do we protect, preserve, but also importantly, enhance that? And it's important. So we know now that greener play can support children's immune systems and probably grown-ups' immune systems as well. So this study looks into the microbiome health of kids that are playing in greened play spaces rather than really sterile play spaces with, like, you know, a single bouncy chicken. And unsurprisingly, it's found that if kids are playing outside, they are more likely to have a healthy microbiome and therefore a healthy immune system, now that we understand that a bit more. And again, this is part of my thinking about how interconnected all of these things are, from the really, really tiny of little like stuff living in dirt to the really macro things as well. And then the other reason why I think policy is really important in this context is that this is not equally spread, right? So we know that there are huge levels of inequality in society, but also inequality in access to nature. So this Natural England study that came out was the first study that actually asked kids about their time going outside. And it was found that kids reported going outside even less during lockdown. Perhaps that's not surprising, but what's really upsetting is that 71% of kids from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds said that they had less time outside, compared to with 57% of white British kids saying the same thing. So that can be for a number of reasons, but we know from other research that actually the access to good quality green space is lower in areas with higher Black and minority ethnic populations. So I think that that's another thing that we really need to think through, is how do you support better access to what we know is important for people's physical health, but also mental well-being as well. So that brings me on to thinking through kind of the policy responses to all of this. we have the 25-year environment plan, which was published in 2018. So we are 2 and a bit years into living the dream that is the 25-year environment plan. But what this is doing is really setting a course for what we can do to support environmental improvement across the board, across a whole wide range of issues, from waste to marine health to natural environment, and agriculture, all across it. And that's being taken forward through the Environment Bill, which is going to be one of the, which is had a slightly on again, off again love affair in Parliament, but it is going back in. And this will be setting in statute a lot of the policies that were laid out in the 25-year plan. And it sets a really high level of ambition, again, not just for protection of the environment, but actual active enhancement of the environment and really being able to deal with, the climate crisis and the other issues that we're facing. So on to planning reform. I think I'm a planner. I've studied at the Bartlett. One of my reflections is that this is not our first radical reform of the planning system, even in my career. So there was the 2004 Planning Act, the 2008 Planning Act, the 2013 Planning Act, and now we move forward into what probably is the most radical reform of those three. What makes this really radical is it kind of starts from the position that what we have isn't working. It's not delivering the outcomes that we're wanting to achieve as a society, right? We are not delivering the homes that need to be delivered. We are not delivering the environmental outcomes that need to be delivered. And importantly, the system has become complex and slow, and we need to really think through from almost a first principles basis, how are we addressing the needs of our society? So going forward into the big change, which is that the new system will have new local plans which will designate sites into 3 categories. I'm sure everybody watching this already knows this, but you will have growth areas, renewal areas, and protected areas. So the idea here is that you will be able to look at a local authority area and really start to say, okay, what is it that we want to see from this place? Where are the places where we think, actually, do you know what, we probably do want some more housing development here, but here are places where you probably need to have a bit more of a balance. We maybe need a bit more retail or commercial or other forms of building. And then these are the places that we absolutely are just going to say, no, this is not for building on. And so I think for me, one of the challenges that my team has is working closely with our colleagues at MHCLG is to think about, okay, well, even in growth areas and renewal areas, this is not a free-for-all, right? This is a serious kind of looking at the kind of the assets of a place, both kind of physical, environmental, and social, and really thinking about, well, how do we protect and enhance? So this has quite a lot of stuff in it. Looking at the kind of big headlines, things that are getting the headlines in the newspapers, very much around the new binding housing targets, the idea that we are going to really reduce the amount of time that it takes to get a local plan in place. I think it's interesting that, even after the 2004 Act, we are still looking at only about 50% of local areas having an up-to-date local plan. That says to me that the system probably isn't working. Also, we really need to make sure, and this is something I feel quite strongly about as well, this idea of making the planning system more accessible by making it digital, by making it something that people can actually physically engage with. At the moment, I don't know how many of you, well, probably quite a lot of people on this webinar, but people in their everyday life don't tend to spend a huge amount of time on their local authority planning website. If you do, you find that you've got a hell of a lot of PDFs which are unsearchable. You've got a lot of issues there which make it very difficult, even as a professional person who has a background in planning, to be able to kind of interrogate, well, what is it that you are trying to do in my place, and how can I be a part of that? Again, thinking through how green spaces can be protected, but also making sure that there are rules in the system. So one of the things about the UK planning system that struck me when I moved here from the States was that it's the planning system in the UK is incredibly negotiated. So pretty much anything is possible with enough kind of negotiation. And so being able to set clearer rules, again, that means that people are more able to kind of know what the rules of engagement are, and then you can work around and through those rules. I'm just going to skip ahead to this kind of bottom bit, the strengthened environmental framework. So again, looking back at the National Planning Policy Framework, making sure that the new policies in that really support climate change mitigation, adaptation, dealing with flood, and creating places that are just better designed and more beautiful. So we are looking at having the national design guidance and having local design plans as well. So what's my take on all of that in my team? So basically, stemming both from the 25-year environment plan, but also from the planning white paper, I think my team and I are engaging both on the sort of systemic reform level. So that's really kind of thinking about what is the framework that we need, what are the frameworks of policies that we need, how can we make sure that environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment, all these things are operating at their optimum level, not just in terms of protecting what we have, but again, and I just keep coming back to this point, enhancing what we could have. So we know from reports that have been out recently that environmental quality across the country is not good enough, and that sites have not been protected in the way in which we would want them to be protected. So here's the question: how do we actually do that in such a way which is simpler and quicker, and ultimately, given the financial constraints, possibly cheaper to help and enable developers and others to make good choices about environmental planning? We're also operating at the strategic level. So that is working with creating local nature recovery strategies. So that will basically be higher tier strategies, which really map out, and again, going back to this whole digital obsession of mine, map out what do you have in terms of habitats? What do you have in terms of your natural environment? And then what are the things that you want to protect? What are the things that you want to enhance? And how does that fit within the plans for development? Currently, we're running 5 pilots for that. So one in Greater Manchester, Cumbria, Cornwall, Buckinghamshire, and Northumberland. So a really big spread, both very rural, but also urban and peri-urban environments. So really starting to think about, well, what would this look like? And then in the Environment Bill, we are taking steps to legislate to make that mandatory across the country. So you would have these upper tier strategies, which really map out what you have in terms of your natural environment and how you want to enhance that. And then at a site-specific level, I have picked deliberately a picture of something which is probably not on anyone's top list of great development. So this is about how do we ensure that every development provides at least 10% biodiversity net gain. So increasing the biodiversity by at least 10% and ensuring that that gain is secured for at least 30 years. So that's an important policy, I think, because what that means is that it's binding developers and others into a statutory commitment to increasing and enhancing the natural environment in their area. So finally, I just have some questions that I wanted to throw out, kind of taking the liberty of being new in the job, and these are the things that I've been kind of thinking about. So what participation and influence, and how does that take account of people who don't live there yet? So one of the issues I think in the planning system has been that local people, a lot of times growing housing, so moving into a local community and making sure that they can be integrated into that community, but also that the community recognizes, that the need to grow. And also, what are the incentives for all sides, which can help us ensure that we're and numinous and have integrated nature to where people are. And then finally, what are the systemic which just mitigates environmental harm to one that actually drives enhancement, which I recognize I have talked about quite a lot. So that is it from me. Thank you. I will stop sharing my slides and largely so I can see the Q&A. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that,
no
Rachel.
I've stunned you all into silence.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I think for a little bit you broke up near the end, but it was good to have your slides out.
Oh no.
Yeah, but I think you were just like reading the questions. So I thought it was really interesting. I'll just kick off and then if anyone, please do ask your questions in the Q&A, and we'll have like 5 minutes of questions for Rachel. So I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned quite interestingly comparing with the states, where you were saying here you realized that the planning system was largely based on sort of negotiation or discretionary sort of decision making rather than having rule based, which is obviously one of the key changes that's put forward in the planning white paper. And and obviously you see it was you talked about the perks of it, or like pitched it as a positive thing, and I'm kind of interested in this because I suppose in terms of one of the responses or one of the worries is that rule-based will decision-making process will potentially kind of put a template or decision-making rule over all of areas and not allow for those different nuances that might require that negotiation. So it would be interesting to how you think of that.
So I think one of the things about setting out a rules-based system is it makes the onus of getting the community involvement right, or in the first place, really, like, it just makes it really important. So you need to make sure that the rules are setting out the incentives, as I talked about, in a way that drives good behavior, right? And I think there are plenty of examples from the States where zoning has not been a positive impact. And I could talk about that, but I should also say my entire professional life has been here. So not actually worked as a planner in the States, but clearly like zoning can be a less than positive tool as well. So I completely agree with you. Like, that is a tension, that is an issue. And I think that's one of the things that is important for people when responding to the white paper consultation, but also just, in engaging with the local planning process as it comes forward. I think that's the whole point. Like, we need to make sure that the community engagement is front loaded, that it's genuinely meaningful. And I think everybody has a slightly different take on that. But also that as we're setting out the kind of 3 different kinds of designations, that the rules really do take into account the widest possible meaning of sustainable development. So really understanding how are the rules going to balance out these different trade-offs between, social, environmental, and economic.
Okay, so we have questions.
So I share your tension.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so questions. First one that came in, there's 4 of them, so I'll try and get. But would local planning authorities have to focus on housing within a local plan if there is no local requirement to increase housing numbers?
Ooh. So I can't speak to the methodology behind the housing metrics, but I'm not sure there is a place that is not needing to at least look at, if not like net increase in numbers. But I think the point here is that all local authorities should be thinking across all of the different needs of their place. Housing, whether that's tenure or quality or whatever, like, that will always be part of the mix, because a place doesn't exist without places for people to live, or places for people to work. And I think there's some really, really interesting questions about how COVID will be impacting that kind of dynamic between places for people to live versus places for people to work.
Okay, thanks. Louis Tam, thanks for the talk. I am kind of a newbie regarding British planning system, so sorry if this is a silly question. I'm wondering, with the 3 categories of development area, the protected areas seem to refer more to natural reserve, although it mentions heritage How about areas that are more occupied by built heritage? Would that still be decided by case which category they fit in?
So my understanding is the details still being worked out on what goes into kind of the guidance around like what goes into each of these different categories. But my understanding is that this is heritage or, protected sites kind of more generally. And I would have thought that that would include built heritage. Gosh, lots suddenly coming in.
Yeah, they are popping up. I might not get over.
We had one in the chat from another panelist, which was basically talking about needing to engage with young people in localities, and I genuinely couldn't agree more. I think really, really engaging with people who, and particularly young people who haven't been engaged in the planning system. And to be honest with you, like, you need to make it like the place where you live is one of the most interesting things you can get involved in, right? And we
Yeah.
need to be able to make it that, engagement accessible to people, including young people. Otherwise, you're basically just sitting in extremely dull planning committee meetings and just thinking, why am I
Yeah.
here? Which, so I think there is that kind of like question about like, how do you actually make planning engaging? And I'm hoping the digital reforms will make that a thing.
All right, just a couple. I'm going to try to, lots of questions coming in. So sorry, I might not be able to get through all of them. But Susie West, thanks for the great overview. What do you see as the role for understanding past environments in the planning system? Is this a missing part for connecting communities with past place characteristics as well as present and desirable futures? That might be slightly academic sounding.
More of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
No, I think so. I think the thing is, and I'm just sort of like skimming through the kind of observations. I think there's a lot of stuff here about the obviously heritage and the historic environment. And one of the kind of heritage and the historic environment is one of the assets that we should be taking into account whenever we plan for a place or for kind of new development. And it's one of the kind of starting points of a place.
Yeah.
I think the challenge, though, is how do you create a shared vision for the future, which is based on on heritage and based on the past, but which actually is incredibly forward-looking and forward-thinking. So when I was working on the Towns Fund and thinking through, how do you support places who have serious economic disadvantage and all of these issues, like how do you support places to really think as a community about what they want the future of this place to be, something which again like is very, very rooted in the past but which isn't tied to it in such a way that it means that they can't move on. And I think that's one of the challenges, which isn't about planning necessarily. It does have its expression in the built environment, but it is genuinely about how it goes back to this kind of engagement thing. So engagement isn't just about how do you get a plan on a map. And engagement is about what kind of place do we want to live in? How do we want it to feel? What do we want it to be like? Those are much more kind of important questions to my mind than just how do we set the boundaries correctly between this and that. Like that's kind of academic.
Yeah.
It's actually more about how do you want a place to be?
Yeah. Well, we've run out of time, so sorry I can't get to all of the questions, but thank you so much, Rachel. I think that completely was a really good kickoff to think about heritage, natural, and cultural and historic all in one, and then exactly how you ended. How do you want it to be, rather than just like trying to find these more technical aspects of planning? So thank you so much.